Hey ecofictologists, lovely to see you again, or if you're new here, welcome. I hope you're all doing well. Just before we begin, I seem to have chosen the stormiest day of my entire time here to film this, so if you hear some wind howling in the background, just ignore it. This episode marks the end of our Conservation in Ecofiction series, which is kind of sad for me. There's so many more books that I could talk about and so many more people that I would love to interview, and I'm physically having to stop myself from only reading ecofiction books focused on conservation. But I think you guys have had enough of a taste of this topic for now, and it's time to move on. But not yet. Today I thought I'd wrap up the series by talking a little bit about what I learned, especially from the wonderful guests that I was so happy to welcome to the channel. Just in summary, during this series I reviewed a few books. I reviewed 3 Ways to Disappear by Katy Yocom, SkyDance, Fighting for the Wild in the Scottish Highlands by John D. Burns, The Tourist Trail by John Yunker, and Ivory Ghosts by Caitlin O'Connell. I was also fortunate enough to be able to talk to some of those authors, like John D. Burns and John Yunker, as well as welcome Francesca Trotman from Love the Oceans, Sally Snow from Lamave, and Dr. Diogo Verissimo from Lost and Found and On the Edge Conservation. It would be ridiculous if after all that I didn't learn anything. Aside from the obvious conservation facts about tigers or hen harriers or the purple frog in India. Seriously, look it up. If you need a giggle today, it's worth it. I highly recommend. I want to talk about what I learned about writing conservation in ecofiction. I am also an aspiring ecofiction author, and I would absolutely love to portray conservation in my own writing, so I've been trying to absorb everything I can about how it is most effectively portrayed. What's working about what's being done now, and what could we do more of to really make the most of ecofiction's potential? And all that is to come. If you enjoyed the Conservation in Ecofiction series and want to hear more about all things ecofiction, be sure to hit that subscribe button and hit the bell so you get notified every time there's something new for you to learn. And you will definitely want to join the community over on the Rewilding Our Stories Discord server, which I run together with Mary Woodbury from Dragonfly Eco, and the link to that is in the description. And with that, let's just get into it. The first lesson is that conservation is about people. Diogo Verissimo put it beautifully that sometimes we think conservation is about the species and the end goal is about the species, but really it comes down to the decisions of people. So we need to incorporate people into our narratives. In writing ecofiction, John Yunker said that the thing that's going to connect people with your story is the characters. People don't want to be preached to, but they will happily read a book on veganism if it's told through the perspective of interesting characters that they can relate to. Both Francesca Trotman and Sally Snow, scientists who work in conservation in developing countries, highlighted the need for the narratives that we hear to be more diverse, more focused on local voices in various different capacities within the conservation sphere, because conservation is a multifaceted effort and relies on the cooperation of many people from many different walks of life and livelihood. Enough already with the narrative of the Western savior. I want to hear more stories from the perspective of the fisherman, or the local who gains their livelihood from turtle tourism, or perhaps the drug trafficker who's unknowingly creating a conservation crisis. Those are untold stories that should be told, and we sure aren't seeing them in the news or the media, which means that our concept of the conflict is severely biased. This means that we, as outsiders to the situation, might place blame in the wrong place, or might have expectations that are completely unrealistic, or might completely misunderstand what the scope of a conservation issue actually is. Ecofiction that represents these different perspectives has so much potential in really expanding our understanding of conservation, and so we can start placing blame where it really belongs. And it can reach and inspire a wider audience too. Sally mentioned how Filipino people watching her video featuring locals were so excited to see someone that looks like them on the screen, and they were inspired to be like that person that they saw. Conservation affects everyone, so our stories about conservation should reflect that. The second lesson is about message. Going back to that Western savior idea, specifically the savior part, something that Sally mentioned might be helpful was to make the happy ending of the story not something so big that it's unrealistic, but instead to focus on something tangible and achievable, some small victory that you don't have to embellish too much to make it believable. Because unfortunately, conservation work is slow, and every victory, no matter how small, is a step forward and should be celebrated. If your plot is believable and you manage to balance accuracy with hope by achieving something at the end, that sends a much more powerful message to your reader than, wouldn't that be nice if that were possible? Because I'm sorry, but one single person is not going to swoop in and solve the issues of endangered species and illegal poaching and habitat destruction. It's just not that easy. Sorry. In reality, any progress that we make on that front is made up of the work of many, many dedicated people having small victories that add up. And yes, those stories are worth telling too. This goes hand in hand with something that I ask most of my interviewees about, which is the need to switch from these doom and gloom messages to something that is more hopeful and hopefully more motivating to people. Diogo pointed out that for most people, it's quite easy to ignore issues like climate change or habitat destruction because they don't enter our living room. So if the message is too dark or depressing, then people will get overwhelmed and they'll turn it off or they'll put it down. They don't have time to think about global problems that they feel they have no hope of influencing. They have their own problems to think about. And then we lose them and the action that they might have taken. So a hopeful, motivating, and achievable message is key. The next thing to keep in mind is that you, as the author, have a responsibility to be as factually accurate as you can be with anything regarding conservation or science. This means you can't get so carried away with the fictional narrative that the reader gets confused about what's fact and what is fiction. If you want the reader to learn anything from your book, to take something from it and turn it into action in the real world, then the information that you build your narrative around needs to be true. It needs to be accurate. It's a lot to expect of your reader to be able to tell when you're exaggerating for dramatic effect. Additionally, that kind of book would probably attract scientists and people who work with that conservation issue, and the last thing you want is for them to read your book going, "That's not true. That's really not helpful. Where did they get that from?" You want them to come away from your book thinking that you have accurately and faithfully represented their work. This brings me to something that John Burns made me aware of, which is that you need to be aware of how the reader might interpret your work. He brought up the concept of anti-ecofiction, how many of our most ingrained folktales and popular narratives actually put nature in quite a bad light. Little Red Riding Hood's message wasn't wolves are bad, but wolves have been cast as the big bad wolf ever since. It's easier to see sharks or wolves as mindless man-eating beasts instead of the apex predators necessary for the health of the ecosystem that need our help, because then we don't have to empathize with them and we don't have to acknowledge that they are important even if we're afraid of them. So in your narrative, just be aware of some cultural biases that you might introduce into your writing, and try and steer clear of some of the more destructive, cliched representations of nature. If you keep things factually accurate and avoid exaggerating things like aggression or monstrous size or fixation on hunting people, then you're far less likely to instill feelings of fear of nature. Okay, good things always come in threes, so I'm going to leave you with those 3 key messages for today. So, to sum up, Lesson 1, conservation is about people. Let's give the untold stories from the often overlooked perspectives some attention. Our idea of conservation is extremely skewed because we are not hearing all sides of the conversation. Lesson 2, message is important. Keep the happy ending, but make it believable. Focus on tangible, realistic victories that someone could actually achieve to really bring hope to your reader. Lesson 3, be careful of the interplay between fact and fiction, and don't sacrifice accuracy for dramatic effect. Don't create false expectations that progress comes easily. And also, avoid fear-mongering. Inspire a healthy respect? Absolutely. Give people nightmares? Probably counterproductive. But I will leave you on a happy note here, which is that it works. From the author's perspective, something I was so excited to hear was that these stories do reach people. John Burns mentioned how readers have contacted him to let him know that they're now going to educate themselves on the reintroduction of links after reading his book. John Yunker said that he received some really positive messages from readers who didn't necessarily agree with his views before reading the book, but who are now thinking about things like eating seafood or going vegan. These books have made a difference to them, and that might not scale up necessarily to changing the world, but if each of us would reach a couple people, what a difference we could make. So that's all from me today. Remember to subscribe and hit the like button and the bell, and to let me know in the comments below any thoughts that you have about anything I've talked about today. We would also love to see you over on the Rewilding Our Stories Discord server, and the link to that is also in the description. Loved seeing the interviews and want to see more? Become a patron over on Patreon and get the opportunity to ask the interviewees some questions of your own. And I will see you next week, ecofictologists.